State University Institute on World Affairs. It has been my personal honor and privilege to be associated with the Committee on Lectures, the Institute on World Affairs, and the Institute on National Affairs for the good work they do in educating our greater university community of the truly crucial issues which confront all of us as human beings, citizens of the world, Americans, and lastly, but certainly not least, as Iowans. I arrived in Ames personally some 2 years ago to, from the outset, complete my education after nearly a 10-year interruption. As I look backward, I returned to college in order to uncover what I truly consider the very best that is within me. I believe I have roughly approximated that rather lofty ideal. One must never stop reaching, because reaching is the path to growing. Growing is the path to learning. And learning is truly what inspires us, and it is truly what empowers us. I would like to begin to repay the debt that I have incurred along this rather winding path of personal discovery. First, to this great land-grant institution, an institution which provided admission to me, excellent financial aid, an institution which provided the support services necessary for the realization of my personal ambitions. Iowa State University of Science and Technology must be protected, must be preserved, and must be enhanced for future generations of students who possess the burning desire to learn and succeed. Second, to the Committee on Lectures and the great opportunities it offers to all students without regard to race, gender, age, nationality, to enrich themselves. And to Pat Miller, Executive Secretary of the Committee on Lectures, as well as the coordinator of the Lectures program. She has acted periodically as psychiatrist, advisor, mentor, all rolled up into one very special woman, offering those very important yet simple lessons of life, like, how to get along with people, acting as a sea of serenity and stability when those spasms of paranoia sometimes sweep me. And she'll say, "Now, Van, everyone really does like you." Ladies and gentlemen, the old world order is gone. Since the late 1940s, there have been in place a bipolar world system, which was an offspring of the Cold War. The system was composed, on the one hand, of the United States and the rest of the NATO countries. These nations may by and large be characterized by free market economies and democratically elected governments. On the other hand, there was the Soviet Union and the rest of the Warsaw Pact nations. Those countries may be characterized by centrally planned economies and socialist governments. Recent history, however, has witnessed the destruction of the Berlin Wall, the reunification of Germany, the dismemberment of the Soviet Union, the disintegration of the Warsaw Pact, as well as the relative decline of American political and economic power. One may very well ask, what's next? Are we entering into a period of time somewhat similar to that period after World War I, where the sun was truly setting on a declining British Empire, struggling to retain its hegemonic status, and a rather reluctantly rising United States awash in an isolationist psychology? Will a new world order be formulated, bringing a complete global acceptance of free markets and representative democracy? Will the end of the Cold War bring other wars, trade wars, the wars between the rich and the poor? What effect will this new world order have on labor, refugees, the media, and the environment? Or is it truly the end of history? That is what our week is all about. The students, faculty, and staff of the Institute on World Affairs have worked rather diligently to bring to you, the greater university community, the finest minds from around the world to speak on this crucial topic. Before I introduce our keynote speaker this evening, I'm reminded of a quotation of a man of the Midwest, one of history's great architects, urban planners, social philosophers, humanitarians, Frank Lloyd Wright, who wrote, So the genius of our democracy still lies hidden in the eternal law of change. Growth, our best hope, consists in understanding at last what other civilizations have only known about and kept to themselves, comforted meantime in the realization that all one does either for or against truth, serves it equally well. And now to our keynote, Robin Wright. She is a native of Ann Arbor, Michigan, and a graduate of the University of Michigan, having earned a Master of Arts degree in 1971. She was visiting professor at Duke University and a Poynter Fellow at Yale University. She currently is the Washington correspondent for the Los Angeles Times and was senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Robin Wright provided commentary on the Gulf War for CBS, NBC, and ABC News, and her books include Flashpoints, Promise and Perils of a New Era, In the Name of God, The Khomeini Decade, and Sacred Rage, The Wrath of Militant Islam. She has just returned from a 3-week trip covering the Soviet Union for The New Yorker. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives the Institute on World Affairs great pleasure to introduce to you Robin Wright.
Thank you, Van. I'm not sure you left me much to talk about. I've come through 9 time zones, 4 continents, and 3 seasons to be with you today. I will say that I didn't think there would be any place besides the Soviet Union where the weather could be this bad, but I guess it's trying to make me feel at home. It's a special privilege to be with you tonight at a moment, a turning point in history, a period of history that's moving so quickly that every week seems to outdo the last in terms of shattering news events. Indeed, the breadth of global change over the past 2 years and the astonishing pace of it are arguably unparalleled in human history. Can't hear me very well? I'm not even sure it's on.
It's on.
But the changes that have swept the world since the fateful autumn of 1989 mark a lot more than simply the end of the Cold War, the demise of old tyrannies, and the opening of new political and economic freedoms. They also mark the fulfillment of centuries of revolutionary dreams. First, the most abhorrent ideologies, from Marxism and military dictatorships to apartheid, have finally begun to succumb to the universal cry for universal rights in places as different as the Soviet Union and Chile and South Africa. The premises of the Age of Reason are at long last being accepted worldwide. Second, empowerment of the individual, as originally promised by the Enlightenment, is finally making its way down to the common man and woman in the poorest and least developed parts of the globe. The world's last serfs, at least in principle, are being liberated. The world's last empires are on the verge of formal collapse. And third, the progress of the scientific era has given humanity unprecedented knowledge and control over everything from space exploration and genetic engineering to the artificial intelligence of computers. We no longer need to depend on myths for answers and sustenance. By some reckonings, almost 500 years have passed since mankind experienced anything comparable. The modern era was marked 500 years ago when Europe's fiefdoms began consolidation into the embryos of modern states and empires, when the great geographic explorations began to chart the globe and bring together diverse people into a common and acknowledged single world, when the first fragile links of communication among distant continents were established, and when scientific breakthroughs opened the way for what eventually became the Industrial Revolution. The current changes are leading us in whole new directions. In terms of politics, traditional nation states are beginning to be transformed and even replaced. In terms of discoveries, as the last earthly frontiers have been charted, we are looking at the possibilities of space. And in terms of innovation, development now depends far more on technology and information than on access to iron ore and chemicals or control of large land masses. Instead of exploiting the Earth's wealth, we are now trying to learn how to preserve it. In other words, the changes involve more than just shifts in political or economic systems. Change now centers on the very premises of progress that have led mankind not only in our lifetimes, but for a whole era. But for all the hope of a new balance of power that will in turn lead to a new peace, the transition to a much heralded new world order is unfortunately, so far, very disorderly. The Soviet conversion has deteriorated into a serious economic morass. A week ago today, I was in the Soviet Union and the dollar was worth 32 rubles. Today, it's worth 47. Next week, they're predicting it'll go as high as 70. The economy is disintegrating, literally, on a daily basis. In South Africa, the end of apartheid has been stalled by a brutal and bloody new round of violence. Countries from Yugoslavia to India are unraveling under the pressure of internal passions we once thought were long forgotten or submerged. Other countries struggling to make transitions to free market economies, from Peru to Mozambique, are threatened with crushing poverty they cannot reverse and ever-growing populations they cannot control. And in our country, we face the biggest debt of any nation in history, a huge trade imbalance, more than 1 in 7 living in poverty, and 10% or 23 million living off food stamps, almost scandalous inequities in health care, virtual inaction on the plight of the homeless, and a population so apathetic in the midst of all those problems that they don't even turn out to vote. In other words, what lies ahead is as challenging as it is hopeful. The paradox is in part natural. Transitions from one era to another have historically been troubled times. This one has already demonstrated it will be no exception. The final 10 years of the 20th century, the final 10 years of the second millennia, will be just as messy and uncomfortable. But part of the paradox is also a trademark of the new era. Indeed, I believe paradox is likely to be one of the dominant characteristics of the new era. Issues and trends evolving in disparate and even unfamiliar ways. Powerful currents surging in different, even occasionally opposite directions. Based on 2 years of traveling all 6 inhabited continents for a new book that comes out next month, I've chosen 3 broad trends to identify today to provide a taste of the future. And of course, if you're interested in reading any more, my book is called Flashpoints. Each trend will have a major role in shaping the era ahead, and each reflects the paradox we're going to face. The first trend is in politics. Today, there are more democratic nations than at any time in history, not only in the former East Bloc. For the first time in history, all of Latin America is democratic. 16 of the 50 African nations are moving toward democracy, while others are under pressure to follow suit. Just last week, Zambia held the first multi-party elections in 19 years and voted out of office the one man who had ruled in Lusaka since independence from Britain in 1964. The wave sweeping toward democracy worldwide is truly of tidal proportions. Unfortunately, there's a paradox. The bottom line is that while the end of the 1980s marked the challenge to communism and to socialism, the end of the 1990s is likely to be marked by the challenge to democracy, even among some of our allies and friends. The reason? As history tells us, democracies usually survive only in countries where the majority of people live above the poverty line. And in many of the new democracies we are now celebrating, the majority of people live at or even below the poverty line. Democracy, as it turns out, is very expensive. As they stand now, many of these countries, mainly in the Third World, mainly in the East Bloc, simply do not have the funds, expertise, or technology to sustain democracy. They have limited and, in some cases, no resources to transform their economies, to convert old industries into more viable, modern businesses, to buy new equipment, or even to provide the new forms of education needed to stabilize or secure what are now only the seeds of democracy. Unfortunately, the United States and other industrialized nations in the West are no longer in a position to keep poorer nations alive indefinitely. We're basically broke. Western Europe is going to have trouble just bailing out Eastern Europe. Japan, which has already replaced the United States as the world's largest donor, is a small country. And because of the worldwide recession, private industry and private banks have limits on what they can gamble with in still unstable foreign environments without jeopardizing their own survival. And if democracy is not seen as a means of bringing a better life to people, then disillusionment is bound to set in. I emphasize bringing a better life, for democracy is perceived today not only as the freedom to vote, and freedom of the press, and the right to dissent, freedom of religion. It's also perceived as the right to prosperity. When new democracies do not lead to improved economies, desperation and disillusionment is almost certain to lead to higher crime and unprecedented proportions, already evident in several Latin American nations. Drug use and prostitution, the latter already a serious problem in several former East Bloc countries. And most dangerous of all, the eventual crumbling of democracies into authoritarian rule, already evident in places like Guatemala and a real possibility in parts of the Soviet Union. The disillusionment with democracy is already visible in two cases. Excuse me, I brought back a Central African bug with me from Moscow as well. In Peru, democracy has been struggling to take root since 1980. Since then, the country has had 3 democratic presidential elections. Yet recent public opinion polls indicate greater fear and disillusionment than ever about whether democracy can solve Peru's many problems. One small statistic from the World Bank explains why. In 1985, less than 1% of Peruvians could not afford to buy food. By 1990, the figure had risen to 17%. Desperate people simply can't afford the transition period. In Poland, the country that led the way in confronting communist rule in Eastern Europe a decade ago, the first fully free parliamentary election since World War II was held at the end of October. The results were stunning. Disenchantment was so deep that almost 60% of the electorate didn't bother to vote. And those who did vote were so divided that no party won more than 12%. The deeply fragmented new parliament will have some 24 different political parties vying to enact their diverse programs in the national legislature. Most telling, however, is the fact that the former Communist Party, now renamed the Democratic Left Alliance, came in second. Indeed, most of the parties that did well advocated greater government intervention in economic affairs, reflecting the popular anxiety over rising employment and the threat of mass layoffs. Democracy in many countries is literally too expensive, a luxury they may want, but they can't afford. In other words, I would contest Mr. Fukuyama's claim, and he will be here next week to talk to you, that this is indeed the end of history. I think democracy's survival in many parts of the world is far from assured. The second trend is to the challenge to the basic unit of politics, of commerce, of international diplomacy, and even of warfare in the modern era. The challenge to the nation state. It's something we take for granted, we don't even think about, because the consolidation of nation states out of city-states has long been considered one of the facts and great feats of the modern era. But the nation state may now be becoming obsolete for several reasons. One is the very definition. Throughout the modern era, we've equated nation with state. But in fact, a nation is a people, and a state is a form of government. And as we're discovering often painfully, nations and states are not synonymous. Many countries, from Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union to neighboring Canada, are relearning just how many nations are living in one state. In Canada, there are at least 2 nations if you discount the Indians. Yugoslavia, there are 6 republics, but 24 nations spread among them. The Soviet Union has 15 republics, but 104 different nations or ethnic groups living in 15 republics. And now each is aware of the right to be empowered, and each now wants some degree of control over their lives. Another reason the nation state is being challenged is because modern ideologies, whether democratic or socialist, have emphasized the socio-political concept of the melting pot, the assimilation of nations in a single state, either by choice, as in democracies, or by force, as in communist states, in the name of a common political or economic good. But again, as we're discovering, the melting pot often doesn't work, except in culturally homogenous countries like Japan, or in countries such as the United States, with sufficient flexibility and freedom and wealth to accommodate the demands and needs of a widely diverse population. And as many groups in this country will tell you, we still don't do it all that well. Separate identity, be it through national, cultural, racial, or religious roots, is proving stronger than the pull to assimilate. The result is that many modern nation states are now headed toward disintegration. But there's a paradox again. Many communities are at the same time moving toward integration, toward joining together with other nations in new regional blocs. The model has been established by the European Community, which will unite 12 nations in a single bloc, with a common currency and common passports and many common laws by 1992, just 2 months away. Last month, that union expanded. The 12 European Community nations agreed with the 7 nations of the European Free Trade Association to form the world's largest trade bloc by 1993. The new European Economic Area, extending from the Arctic to the Mediterranean, will account for 43% of the world's trade by 1993. The former Soviet Union is headed in a similar direction. After the process of disintegration over the past year, in which all 15 republics have declared either sovereignty or full independence, Russia and 7 of the 14 other republics signed an agreement while I was in the Soviet Union, uniting them in a new economic bloc. Little noticed was a second agreement signed among 5 Asian republics within the Soviet Union that will also lead them on a separate path, but together. In Yugoslavia, Croatia and Slovenia, 2 provinces trying to break away, are now looking to join the European community. Both have already established offices in Brussels. The same is true in Czechoslovakia, as the Czech and Slovak republics talk of separating from each other, but at the same time integrating alongside each other into the European community. The trend's not limited to Eastern Europe. As separatism in Quebec grows, Canada may well disintegrate after 124 years of unity. But the prospect is less frightening for Canada, as well as its neighbors, than it was during the first round of secessionist talk in the 1960s, because Quebec wants to integrate into the North American Free Trade Zone that will group Canada with the United States and Mexico into a new regional bloc. The bottom line, the whole concept of sovereignty is changing as the nation state becomes less viable because of the growing interaction and interdependency of the world in trade, in political formulations, in diplomacy, and as we saw in the Persian Gulf, even in warfare. The world map will change accordingly. Again, often in paradoxical ways. The year I was born, 57 nations came together for the first time in the United Nations. This year, with the induction of 6 new members, there are 166. 90 countries, more than half of the world's total of 173, have become independent in my lifetime. And despite all that, I'm not all that old. As the world's last 2 major empires, the Soviet and the Chinese, begin to crumble, others will be added to the world roster. The same may be true as well in Africa and Latin America and Asia. So the new era will witness a sorting out process, and in the end, a redefinition of the basic unit of governance and a redrawing of the world map. The third trend is in the nature of warfare. As with the sweeping political changes, we have much to celebrate in terms of recent conflicts. Many of the more than 127 conflicts that have plagued the world in the Cold War era have either recently been resolved or are headed toward resolution. There's even a glimmer of hope, and on this occasion I stress glimmer more than hope, that the world's longest ongoing conflict, involving 5 modern wars, will be diffused and maybe even eventually, again I stress eventually, resolved at the process that was begun at Madrid between Arabs and Israelis this week. But at the same time, there is a paradox. While the threat of an apocalyptic nuclear showdown between the East and the West has indeed diminished, the danger of conflict has not abated, because the arena and the flashpoints of conflict have shifted. In the modern age, conflict has predominantly pitted country against country over ideology or territory. Today, however, warfare is increasingly within societies, a pattern that will surely intensify as national, ethnic, and religious passions also intensify. In explaining the strife in their own countries, Mikhail Gorbachev and various other leaders have all started using a common word. It's called Lebanonization, modeled on the war where I spent 5 years of my life, in Beirut. The enemy is no longer just outside, it is often within, a pattern visibly being played out in South Africa, Pakistan, Yugoslavia, India, the Philippines, Iraq during 2 uprisings after the Gulf War over issues that are still unresolved, and several ethnic groups within the Soviet Union. The danger of conflict is also not abating for a second reason. Although the U.S. this fall has taken an initiative to eliminate massive stocks of nuclear weapons, the paradox is that the threat of nuclear or major wars may actually increase because of a simultaneous trend: small countries acquiring big weapons. Worldwide, the hope of peace has been dissipated because of the spread of 3 deadly weapons of mass destruction: nuclear capabilities, chemical or biological weapons, and ballistic missiles, beyond the control of superpowers to a host of smaller powers like Iraq. But the crisis the outside world faced in Iraq was not unique. In the third world, at least 10 countries have or are working on nuclear capability. At least 22 countries have or are working on chemical weapons and or biological weapons. And at least 25 have or are working on ballistic missiles that will allow them to target neighbors or nearby countries, as Iraq did against Saudi Arabia, Israel, Bahrain, and Qatar. In the hands of unstable, dictatorial, and insecure regimes, the potential for these weapons of mass destruction to be used is much higher than when they are in the hands of major powers, who at least balance each other off and thus create an incentive not to use them. I'm not trying to justify any country having weapons of mass destruction. I frankly am for banning them all. But the reason arms proliferation in the third world is more dangerous than in the industrialized world is that, unlike the arrangements worked out between the United States, the Soviet Union, and Europe, there are no controls, there are no treaties, there are no hotlines, no mechanisms for deterrence. And the threat is not just on paper. Last year, we witnessed the first nuclear scare in the third world as India and Pakistan, both countries believed to have nuclear capabilities, went on full alert because of the escalating conflict over Kashmir. The bottom line, while the war with Iraq had many unique characteristics that make it unlikely to be repeated, the kind of war fought in the Persian Gulf with Scud missiles and chemical weapons, and the threat of them at least, and the potential for the use of nuclear weapons by a third world country is likely to be the model for warfare for the future. Now, I'm the first to admit that all of this may seem rather bleak. I've put these trends in their starkest terms deliberately, not to scare you away, but to emphasize the scope of change that lies ahead, the stakes for the next generation, and the importance of everyone's role, be it simply awareness or more direct activism in dealing with these trends and others. But to conclude, there is a comforting note. As of today, the shape and the ground rules of the new era are a long way from being set in final form. We are only in a transition. And we have an important advantage over any earlier era of history. We can see change and understand it as it happens. When Columbus landed in the Americas 500 years ago, he did not know that he had discovered a new hemisphere and taken a giant leap toward linking the continents into a single world. In contrast, be it a coup attempt in the Soviet Union, a war in the Persian Gulf, the end of apartheid in South Africa, or any other major event taking place around the world, we can now see it and react to it instantaneously. In other words, we have control over the direction and pace of change as never before. We have choices. I'll close by saying that I envy those of you who are students in this audience, because many of those choices will be yours. I thank you. That's all right, I can do it. I've been told if anyone would like to ask a question. Yes, ma'am.
Just one question, because we have traveled in the Soviet Union, I assume China. I understand there is an extensive shelter system underground for protecting the population of what used to be Soviet Union. Also, Red China has this system. Switzerland, many smaller countries are prepared for nuclear war. And of course, the United States has not done this for us. I wonder if there is more information about shelters, civil defense, protection of the population in the event of a nuclear war.
Gosh, I thought I could speak on anything, and you stumped me, because the question really was about information. The questioner has heard about shelter systems built in the Soviet Union and China, Switzerland, and other countries, which the U.S. doesn't have to protect against nuclear warfare, the use of nuclear weapons. I don't know. I must say, several times I've been to the Soviet Union and I've been to China, and I went to boarding school in Switzerland, and I've never seen shelter systems. I assume they're the kind of bomb shelters we had when we were back in the 50s and 60s, but I don't know. You stumped me, and I've got to find out.
I've not visited those countries, and I just wondered if you knew about them.
Yes, sir.
You spend so much time overseas. You know, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was sort of euphoria in the U.S. press about how wonderful capitalism was and how sad events had become in Asia. But now that euphoria seems to have diminished. I wonder if you would comment on how the U.S. looks to you as an American citizen who spent so much time in Europe and Asia.
That's a very good question. He basically asked, as someone who's lived overseas, and I've spent 20 years as a foreign correspondent on every continent except Antarctica, how does the United States look to me that in the euphoria after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, everyone was heralding capitalism, but there's some questioning about it now, and how do I look at it personally? I have to say that I left this country during the when hippies were in, and I returned and yuppies were in. And I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I never saw a homeless person in my life. And I live in Washington, D.C., and a part of Georgetown, and they took down a house recently, and there were 32 homeless people in it. I mean, I truly cannot believe what's happened. I think there is I think the world's in for a terrible shock, both about democracy and about capitalism, because there's so many countries who are just not going to make it. We don't have, this is what I was trying to tell you earlier, we simply don't have the resources. Peru's going to go down the tubes, barring some miracle. And the problems compound themselves in such a terrible way. I mean, whether it's debt and unemployment, all the things that spiral, and then they have cholera epidemics, which take such a devastating toll. I was in Zimbabwe, a country I covered when it was Rhodesia during the the civil war there. And this was a country that survived, what was it, 13 years, I guess, or 15 years of international isolation, economic sanctions, ostracization by the entire world. And what's the great threat of the 20th century going to be? AIDS. 60% of the army in Zimbabwe is HIV positive. The implications are just so staggering. It's going to not be able to defend itself. A whole generation in the labor productive years is going to be wiped out. Extraordinary number of orphans left behind. The infrastructure of the nation is going to be challenged. And it has to make some choices. Do you try to keep these people alive? Do you even get involved in education and condom distribution? Or do you just, how do you pay for all of this? Countries can't afford that. In Zimbabwe, a condom is 39 cents in a country where, the income is, the average income among Africans is probably 150, well, probably less than that. Well, anyway, it's very low. They can't afford it. I have grave fears about many corners of the world, and I think that there is some disillusionment with the greediness of capitalism, that there's not a spirit of giving or sharing in it. And that there are many countries that after 2 or 3 generations, after all, we're talking 70 years in some cases, of socialism or communism, that at least there was a social net to absorb them. It may not have been a good life, but at least there was some kind of health care, some kind of education, some kind of social services. I'm not convinced that any part of the Soviet Union that fragments or becomes independent is going to be capable for the next generation of providing comparable service. There may be some better services for those who can pay in hard currency, for an elite few, much smaller than the elite of the communist elite was, but that the majority of people are just going to get nothing. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges of this transition period, proving that democracy really is the best way, trying to reassure countries and finding means to help them pay for it. I just don't know how we're going to do it. Yeah.
So let's follow up with that. Is democracy the best way? I mean, is that a given?
Well, that's my prejudice. I mean,
What do you think about the idea of the third way that was listed?
the third way has been talked about in the third world basically since 1955. And what's interesting is the fact that most third world countries have abandoned the third way because they've just never come up with a system, be it Ujamaa, the kind of African version of socialism in Tanzania, developed by Julius Nyerere. I used to go around the Ujamaa farms as they were clearing the way. It didn't work. There's no third world system that is adapted based on local culture, custom, history, that has worked. It'd be wonderful, but I just don't. There's nothing that has convinced them, and at the end of the day, most of them, as we saw in Zambia just over the last few days, have opted for for democracy. The interesting question is that in Zambia, I think about 80% of the people, maybe even 90%, but the last official figure I saw was 80%, voted against the incumbent president for a noted trade unionist who has been in and out of jail for the better part of 2 decades. The interesting question is, if he doesn't do well, will he allow the kind of democracy to vote him out of power? And it'll be, the rule in Africa always was one man, one vote, one time. And it'll be interesting to see what happens.
But actually, what I was not referring to the 50s and 60s. I'm talking about sort of contemporary third way. I think.
Even India's abandoned talk of a third way. I mean, if you can tell me an example, and
They're trying here. I mean, India, on some level, is a democracy. Right? They vote in and out. They voted Indira Gandhi out of that. She usurped the government. She went back to the election. They voted her out. They certainly live below the poverty line. Right? The masses certainly are below the poverty line. They have a mixed economy. They have a large state sector and a large private sector.
but they also need huge government subsidies for certain goods so that people can eat. I mean, yes, it is.
But it's working.
It's working. I would argue, and it's the one exception, it's the one hopeful indication that maybe a third world country can do it. But I also think that India is in a lot of trouble. The country has fragmented into 3 nations since 1948, 47. And I'm not sure the fragmentation is over. The emergence of the BJP, which is the religious party, which went from having 2 seats in 1984 now to being the largest opposition group in India's parliament, indicates that the kind of religious fundamentalism that we've seen among Shiites in Lebanon and Iran is not limited. I mean, one of the trends I think that's most interesting around the world is the use of religion in politics, but that's a very divisive issue in India because it pits Muslims against Hindus and Sikhs and so forth. So yes, India is the one hopeful sign. If India holds together, there's hope for many parts of the third world. But I'm not sure India is going to hold together as it is.
Actually, it hasn't fragmented. Before 1947,
No.
it was